Okay, we are going to begin. Let me remind you, in the back of the room and outside, there are index cards. So in the course of the presentations, if you have questions, get an index card, write them down. You don't have to wait till the end. And if you raise your hand, a staffer will collect them so we can move it along. All right? We are going to begin with AFL-CIO Organizing Director, Elizabeth Bunn. Elizabeth, go.
Hey, thanks, Phil. The women on our panel have made a collective decision, exercising our collective female power, that we are going to sit and rather than stand at the podium. So I hope that works for everybody. Try to make this as conversational as we can. So I also want to extend my thanks to President Weingarten and to the three sponsors of this forum. I think it's great. It's a great conversation. It's not going to be the last time we have it. We need to continue it. I'm here not to talk about the total AFL-CIO program, but one portion of it. And that portion of it is about industry strategies and multi-union collaboration with community partners. And it goes along, we hope, we think, in good part with the wonderful remarks by President Weingarten to kick off our conversation here. So let me just say a couple of historical things that we all know and are very obvious. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is power, workers exercising power against those institutions and those entities that set wages, hours, and working conditions for them and for those communities. And that's not just government, that's multinational corporations, that's global corporations. So as we go about this discussion, we will not be successful without a vehicle to confront those institutions. Historically, we all know that unions and collective bargaining, what we're calling conventional collective bargaining or traditional collective bargaining, but at the end of the day, whether it's the guild unions or the industrial unions, it's about a way to take those institutions that are setting wages and benefits and having power to influence their decision making. Whether it's auto, steel, and mining in the last century, or take teachers and nurses, an example that I like to use because I was very involved in gender pay disparities back in the day and continuing, unfortunately. And you saw the historically female-dominated occupations of teachers and nurses address those disparities as they joined collectively into trade unions. Today, we face significant challenges. Obviously, some of those have been talked about, and those are created by global capital precisely because of the economic and political success of trade unions and collective bargaining. Now, given how far the corporate agenda has pushed U.S. labor relations outside the global framework of fundamental worker rights, many in the United States, even among our progressive allies, have concluded that collective bargaining is no longer a viable path to raising wages and working conditions, that we can, in other words, no longer influence wages and benefits through collective bargaining, that it's no longer an effective vehicle for change. We don't believe that, and I'm going to talk about one specific campaign and our strategies, but I do think it's important to point out as we continue this important debate that this is primarily an American controversy. Around the rest of the world, the centrality of collective bargaining is not under debate. Workers in Brazil, Sweden, Croatia, Georgia, South Africa, Kenya, Japan, Indonesia, and beyond are not debating whether collective bargaining with employers by workers in worker organizations is the best way to improve wages and working conditions. That said, the obstacles in this country to worker organizing are obscenely difficult. And as a consequence, we need to engage in strategies that are well-researched, well-resourced, industry-focused, and broadly visionary and inclusionary. We have to understand how wages and benefits are set and build power to influence the corporate decision makers. The goal, of course, is to take wages and benefits out of competition so that corporations are competing on the basis of quality and innovation and not on the basis of who can most quickly race to the bottom. So let me talk about one campaign that we think combines a lot of these elements. What do we think are elements of continuing success? A comprehensive industry analysis and strategy. Participation by a broad coalition of community partners. Now, this is not only the morally right thing to do, which it is, of course, by the way, it's also necessary. I think Randy's formulation about how bargaining needs to be much more community-based is spot on. Good jobs, when we talk about good jobs, we can no longer define those just by wages and benefits, but as opportunities to lift up whole communities, to bring up disadvantaged communities, to have robust training programs and ladders of opportunity. And we need to use policy tools that advance our objectives. To be sure, we don't have the power we once did, but especially in combination with broad coalitions, we do have some power, and we need to use that strategically. So the specific campaign, you probably guessed, that I want to talk about is called Jobs to Move America. And its focus is limited, but it's an entire industry. It's the industry of passenger and bus manufacturing throughout the United States. And specifically, the goal is to increase the number and the quality of American manufacturing jobs in that industry. Again, quality being defined broadly. Our coalition is spearheaded, actually, Harold in his remarks alluded to one success already in the campaign, which I'll get to in a minute, but our coalition is spearheaded by the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, LANE, and includes environmentalists, civil rights advocates, philanthropic, organizations and labor. It's a multi-union initiative. We still, unfortunately, in the labor movement, need to learn to work together more effectively. Hey, good job. Can you do one more? The industry itself is fascinating. Each year we spend about $5.4 billion of public money to manufacture passenger rail cars and buses. This is work that our country invented and developed. But today, there is not one single US-based manufacturer of rail cars and buses. All are foreign owned. This was once a highly unionized industry. Today, not so much. In bus, only Gillig and New Flyer are unionized, and in rail, only Alstom, which is a Canadian corporation. Decisions on the purchases of these vehicles is typically made by, and here's the centerpiece of the campaign, is typically made by local transit agencies. But since federal dollars are generally involved, federal regulations also apply, which, by the way, creates additional opportunities to influence how public money is spent. Since the procurements are typically local, we have opportunities to influence decisions even in red states. So, what we have created is a model policy tool that incentivizes for the following: good wages and benefits, increased number of U.S. jobs in assembly and along the supply chain, hiring from disadvantaged communities, and promotion of robust workforce development and development opportunities. Nothing about unions, you say. Well, maybe not specifically, but our unionized companies are currently at a disadvantage when bidding on procurements. By adoption of this model RFP language, it enables our unionized companies to compete. It also helps to reduce employer opposition to worker organizing. And it opens opportunities for us to have conversations with companies that manufacture these vehicles about what the public wants to see from manufacturing in our country. It provides a vehicle for us to have conversation with companies, and I don't want to say anything further about that in terms of unionization. Sound like a pipe dream? We've already had success in getting, I know time is up, but just give me one more minute. In Los Angeles, a bus procurement went to New Flyer, a unionized company, as opposed to a non-union company in the South. Harold mentioned Kinki Shario in LA, the only Japanese corporation that has entered into a neutrality card check agreement as a consequence of the implementation of the model RFP language. In Chicago, Amtrak High-Speed Rail, Maryland Purple Rail, and a number of other places that we'll be able to announce soon, we believe, we've been able to incorporate this model RFP language. So again, the key part of this is we spend $5.4 billion annually in public money, and we should demand that that money be spent to create strong communities, and that workers have a voice in the manufacture of these products, and that the corporations are obligated to help build strong communities, not just through a unionized and highly paid and competitive workforce, but also through hiring from disadvantaged communities and robust workforce development programs. We look forward to the next conference with news of even greater success. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, brothers and sisters. For those of you who are ready to slit your wrists after Brother David Rolfe's presentation, I want to just point out the article that was, or the column that was in the New York Times on the 13th. The title is, "Wanna Be Happy? Join a Union." And I thought that this was actually extraordinary, and I just want to start by quoting the research that was done by two academics, one of them from the University of Arkansas, which I thought is an evidence of the expansion of our movement. We find that labor union members are more satisfied with their lives than non-members. The effect of being in a union is powerful. The study notes that union membership offers a bigger boost in satisfaction than actually getting a raise. It does come in a little less satisfactory than getting married. So I guess that explains the marriage equality movement. The study basically says that if you're a union member, you have perhaps the reason that life is better for you or that you're happier is that you have a greater feeling of job security, you're afforded numerous opportunities for social interaction and integration, and you have enhanced participatory benefits of being engaged as a democratic citizen. It really struck me because often we forget that one of the revolutionary concepts that built this country was the pursuit of happiness, and that was actually revolutionary. And so I've only had since the 13th to process this, but I'll be meeting with my organizing director, Phil Kugler here, and asking him how we're going to advance happiness in our next organizing campaign. Yay! Let's hear it for being happy. So last year, the AFT announced that our membership had grown to 1.6 million members from a scrappy small union in the early 1960s. This is sort of a remarkable achievement. And what underlies this consistent growth? Phil Kugler, who was given the role of moderating this panel because of the 5 unruly panelists up here. So just think of me as mini Phil Kugler this morning. Points out our success as being attributable to 3 factors. One is leadership support. This is built into the DNA of the way that our leaders think. Second, that the union consistently commits funds and other resources to organizing and growth strategies. And third, that there's a high amount of tolerance and, in fact, support for experimentation. And I'm going to give you a few examples. One is there was talk about minority unionism, and I want to describe our associate membership program, which I would secretly call associate membership on steroids. Obviously, under federal law, you know that unions have the right to bargain with an employer upon demonstration of sort of voluntary majority membership or voluntary majority support. And this notion that there's a voluntary minority that can play an active role in demanding from their boss better working conditions is alive and well in the AFT. In fact, it is so alive and well that associate membership has actually led us to become the largest union in the state of Texas. It has also allowed us to become the largest union in the state of West Virginia. And we are the largest union in the state of Louisiana. And this is rooted in the beginnings of, with associate membership and then growing to other forms of collective action. Today in Texas, for example, we are 60,000 members strong. This opportunity to engage in a collective action, first of all, coming together with your colleagues, developing a group consciousness, and then moving an action program forward, has allowed workers to really experiment with different forms of organization and actually different forms of collective bargaining, albeit that we can't even call it that. For example, in the state of Texas, because obviously everything there is done backwards on occasion, especially when it comes to worker rights, it is actually illegal. It is in law that teachers are not allowed to bargain collectively. It is against the law for teachers to bargain collectively in Texas, and yet we have 60,000 members there who come together to be in a union. Now, what does this mean? It means workers are incredibly creative. So that's why you end up with agreements like meet and confer. You end up with agreements with school districts around proportional representation, meaning that you demonstrate how many members you have, and then you have the right, based on that percentage, to come to the table, representing that percentage, and come to an agreement with the employer. What does that mean? Usually, after a cacophony of proportional representation, you can get to exclusive representation, where one organization representing a majority of workers can demonstrate that majority and be the exclusive representative for purpose of consultations. But those are incredibly challenging fights. They build activism because they are actually on the frontiers of fighting collectively for a voice. In a state of like West Virginia, where there is also no collective bargaining, what does it mean? It means that you can actually look at legislation, put that together, and it reads like a collective bargaining agreement. The law for teachers in the state of West Virginia, because teachers and workers and school-related personnel and public employees have come together to actually lobby with the state legislators as if they were the bosses, reads like a collective bargaining agreement. We have in state law in West Virginia the right to grievance procedure and arbitration, for example. In Louisiana, in the tradition of Huey Long, the law basically reads, again, backed by workers, that if you are, it is legal for you to organize a union, and it is legal for the employer not to recognize that you have a union. And therefore, it's a total power equation. And that dynamic does allow us to prosper and succeed in behalf of workers. So we think that there's looking at these models, especially in the face of Harris v. Quinn and Friedrichs, that there is real hope. That what our brothers and sisters have said on the panels before is that we don't need bosses and bargaining collectively to define a union. We can win, and we can win in behalf of workers by bringing people together and creating power. The next example that I want to use about the kinds of things that the AFT is thinking about, really in terms of building a union, goes back to sort of the old. I love this, all this new. I'm actually thinking that new is kind of the way that Campbell's Soup does it. They take the old can and they stamp new and improved on it, and voila, it's new. So we're going to take the love the work, hate the job, the story of professionals. And really, this is sort of in the DNA of the AFT. We have a culture of professional development. We believe that workers can own their own growth and career ladders as professionals. And this actually builds collective action and collective power. The example I want to use for you right now is that the AFT, in conjunction with TESS, which is a British corporation, is actually the largest education technology company. You heard me. We are the largest education technology company because we believe that professionals have the right to develop the tools and the means to advance their own profession. So what is this technology company? It's called Share My Lesson. And I urge all of you to take a look at it. It's by teachers and for teachers and of teachers. It is a chance for teachers to post their lesson plans and then to download lesson plans if they're looking for them, and to share their sort of collective wisdom with each other. So, for example, right now, we've been in, the Share My Lesson has been active for 2.5 years. We've had over 8 million downloads of lesson plans. And the wonderful thing, incredible thing about being a technology company is you've got a lot of data to work with. We have close to today 700,000 members, and we've got over a million things that have been posted by workers. This culture of professional development is leading this Share My Lesson. It also means that we put professional development in all of the work that we do. It leads to amazing sessions. For example, I invite you to attend one of our nurse conferences where one of the professional development sessions, this is one of my particular favorites, is called Distinguishing Normal from Abnormal. Could probably use that in this room. Identifying potential mental health and personality disorder issues across the age spectrum. This is workers owning their own work and advancing their own profession. And finally, I just want to say one last thing. We also want to think about everybody else. And this is an incredibly important part of what's important to the AFT, and that is solidarity with all of you. The AFT would not exist if it hadn't been for the fact that industrial unions loaned their organizers when we finally had a chance to fight for collective bargaining in the public sector, and particularly with teachers. And we believe that we have to give back. It is not just an American Idol that we give back. We're going to give back as a labor movement. And so we are looking to get our pension funds. Teacher pension funds have committed $10 billion to invest in infrastructure work, to create jobs for building trades workers and industrial workers, and putting that money to work back in our economy and creating jobs in the private sector. That is an incredibly important part of our organizing and growth strategy. So coming together for change and investment. I've got 7 other examples here, but Phil handed me the yellow note saying that my time is up. So I just want to end with something, just a lesson learned. Change is what we do every day, and we change to adapt to circumstances. That's one of the reasons why Randy Weingarten has 42,000 followers on Twitter, because we adapt to the tools that are available to us and we develop new ones. And I just want to remind us that when the umbrella was invented in the 18th century, there were many people in Britain who believed that umbrellas, they actually argued that umbrellas, being able to have a cover in the rain, would actually undermine their national character. You can see how far they got with that. Let's not be afraid of change. Let's embrace it and let's grow with it. Thank you.
Okay. Sarah?
So I have been listening to the talks, and I just keep changing what my talk is over and over. And so I'm just going to give it a go. There are 3 main things I'm going to talk about. One is to introduce you to the Freelancers Union. The second is really to talk about the needs for a business model. And the third is a new political slogan that I'm not going to say until the end. So how many people here have, well, first of all, where's Stephen Greenhouse? Stephen, what are you going to be doing after you retire?
Maybe freelancing.
How many people here have freelanced at any time in their entire lives? Okay, hands down. How many people think that when and if they turn, well, after they turn, they turn 65, they will be working some kind of gigs? Okay. How many people who think that the young kids today, when they graduate from college, are going to get 40-hour work week job with full benefits and a major defined benefit retirement plan? Great. So we're on this. So Freelancers Union, in great frustration with the wonderful people at the Department of Labor, wanted to get a count on how many people are actually working in this way. And so we did a study with an employer, Elance Odesk, and found that it's 53 million Americans are working independently, 1 in 3 workers. But it's not so simple, because what we found was about 40% are really traditional independent contractors who are classified as independent contractors and are working in certain fields. But to me, the most interesting number was that 27% classified themselves as moonlighters, meaning I have a full-time job, I'm freelancing on the side. That really, to me, the moonlighters are the ones who are freelancing in the context of income inequality in America. They're just trying to get by. And so what's so important to see about this new workforce is that it is so absolutely not monolithic, that people are working in these ways for so many different reasons, some of them good and some of them bad. I think about 15 years ago, there was a big fight about contingent work. It's the precariat, and it's all bad. And it's really just about rapacious employers who are making this workforce happen. And I think a lot of people still think that. And I think there are a lot of employers who really fit that bill. But the truth is that the economy is shifting and work is just more flexible, and that the real strategy has to be to develop power to start talking about how are we going to make this new workforce fair. And I think that what is so interesting about that is that that to me is the crux of this, is that as the new work is evolving, the work is episodic, it's based on gigs, and so people don't get the benefit of, let's say, an unemployment check. So you can work a gig, the gig can last for 8 months, and when the gig is over, you're screwed. But we don't have another example of how to build insecurity. We could come up with all these things that would be under the they are screwed department, but I think that what we should start to see is that freelancers, I think, are starting to show us something about our lives, and why I was an enthusiastic clapper to Jessica's happiness argument is that I think people don't realize that freelancers are actually nationally on strike. And you can see that in the consumption numbers. Look at the consumption numbers that are coming out month after month. Then break it down by quintile, and you will not be surprised to find out that the top quintile, the people who are earning the most are spending the most. And if you take it as an average, consumption is up. But when you start to break it down by working people, you start to see consumption is not up. And when you start to look at the millennials and the next generation, and you start taking the same things, housing, car ownership, and you start to see this generation, they're not buying cars, they're sharing. They're not owning houses, they're renting. And people are starting to say, you know what, this loyalty thing, this 40-hour work thing, like whether I crave it or I don't, it's just not happening for me. So I'm going to keep my nuts small. I'm going to stop consuming. And I am going to start leading my life about time. It's going to be about my neighborhood. It's going to be about the people around me. It's going to be about love. And I think it doesn't get that kind of attention because it doesn't feel somehow weighty or meaty. So we call that the freelance 360 life, that people are really craving that sense of something greater and some larger purpose. We at Freelancers Union call the economic principles around that this idea of new mutualism, that I hope somebody comes up with a far better phrase, and do tell. And the idea is that we're really interconnected, that as we see the government spending decline, and that is a reality, and as we see the decline of some of the institutions that are important, that we're going to be recreating new ones, but that are based on interconnection, that are going to have a time horizon that are 2 generations, 4 generations ahead, and that we can start building up our institutions. And it's interesting, earlier in the last panel, we said that what is the purpose of the labor movement? It is to build our communities. I would say, and I don't know how much time I have, so I can...
Keep going a little,
okay.
not a lot.
Okay, so it's not just about building our communities. It's, yes, that's true, but it's about building our economy. You know, let's look around us locally, let's look up and aside, let's look virtually, and let's just start to say that. Okay, boom, let me keep moving along. Okay, so number 1 is that's freelancers, that's where we're going. Business model. I think this is terribly important. Think of the work that David is doing. Freelancers Union, we believe that you have to have your own money in order to actually be able to move strategically. The revolution will not be foundation funded, and so you've got to start figuring out how you're going to do it. And I think that anybody that's going to say otherwise is just to say it completely full of shit. And so business model must be based on solidarity. There are two critical elements to solidarity. Spirituality and love is one. What do I mean by that? It's the sense that I am part of something greater than myself, that when I'm engaged in collective action, I can see the future, that there's something better. And if you talk to any psychologist, you know, the worst thing about depression is when people feel so alone. But the second part of solidarity is economic interconnection. And we must see that we have to build, you know, I had lunch or breakfast or something with Andy Stern, and he said, you know, it's all about money, because like once you have money, you can kind of figure stuff out, right? Who can't? So money really matters. Now this is the third one. And again, I think somebody has to come up with a better way to say it, but I really believe it. Okay, so remember James Carville, it's the economy, stupid? Well, it's the proletariat, stupid. And so I think what we have to stop doing is saying that this movement is going to be a movement of low-wage workers, high-wage workers, full-time workers. We are all in this together. And I think that at the Freelancers Union, I'm just going to ask another show of hands. How many people think that when you hear freelancer, you think like boutique, yoga, kale-eating, freelance journalist? Come on, it's more, admit it. Okay, we'll ask it another way. 3 years ago, before your consciousness was raised, how many people thought that? Oh, come on. 10 years ago, before your consciousness was raised, how many people thought that? Okay, much better. And so I just want to close by saying two quick things. One is John L. Lewis figured out how to organize when he had a president who built and enacted, really he had Francis Perkins, but let's be honest, and we developed Section 7 rights. And the government didn't create a government program. The labor movement had institutions with a revenue model that were able to take Section 7 rights and make it real. That man, John L. Lewis, mortgaged his building and invented unions. That's right, he was an entrepreneur who invented unions. And I think we have to go back to that. And let me just close this one other thing that I've really noticed, and I think will be evident, and I say this lovingly. But if you look at the experimenters in this field right now, they are all women. Not all, but so many. And I think that labor is a feminist cause for men and women, and the people that have been experimenting in this field are women, whether it's the domestic workers, the taxi cab driver, the teachers union. And I think that we need to start to recognize that. And I say this because my daughter is about to turn 15, and she's an unreconstructed 1970s feminist. And I see how much we are so fearful of talking about these things. It's like, remember George Lakoff, lean into the argument, right? We've not only leaned in, we've fallen in. It's like, stop already. Let's talk about what we really mean and say what needs to be said. And so let's be honest, let's be entrepreneurial, and let's build this movement.
Okay. Christina.
Hey everyone. I was glad to hear AFT was talking about Texas because that's where I hail from. So I'm from Workers Defense Project, and we're a statewide membership-based organization that's winning better working conditions for Texans. So I think our organization, compared to a labor union, is very small, but we're proving that you can even win for workers in one of the toughest political climates in the country, along with our partners, the AFT. So inevitably, when I come to events like this, I hear from folks afterwards in the audience that they feel sorry for me, that doing this kind of work in Texas must be really tough. And I'll be the first to admit that it is incredibly tough organizing in Texas, but that's also why I love it and why I think it's so much fun. Because when you're at rock bottom, you can only go up, and that's exactly what we're doing. So I could talk to you about what it means to organize in a right-to-work state, about what it means to win in a place like Texas that is the second largest economy in the country, or the fact that in our industry, which we focus on the construction industry, and is the largest single contributor to the Republican Party in Texas, by the way, also the largest employer of undocumented labor, and one of the top 10 employers in the state. That's who we're taking on. And I could talk to you about the facts and figures, but I want to talk more about the individual impact, the human stories that impact our work and what we're trying to achieve in Texas and where we go from here. So also to mention, someone mentioned earlier, there's been all these good construction jobs added. These are good middle-class jobs. I will argue that specifically in Texas and where the construction industry is growing the fastest, they are no longer good blue-collar middle-class jobs. In Texas, there are close to 1 million workers in our state in the construction industry, and the building trades will tell you themselves that they estimate that it's 1% of the workforce is unionized, 1%. So in Texas, who really faces the impact of those kinds of conditions are workers on the ground. And as I mentioned, half of the workforce is undocumented. So one of those workers that came to our organization a few years ago was Santiago Arias. And Santiago, like many workers in the construction industry, had come because he had been mistreated on the job. And he was doing demolition work, which if you know anything about demolition work is dirty, dangerous work, making $10 an hour on a commercial project in downtown Houston. His employer didn't want to pay for a harness, and so he sent him up several stories, and Santiago fell. And they rushed him to the hospital, and they were able to save his life. But today he's a quadriplegic, and he'll never walk or work again. And Santiago left the hospital with close to $1 million in medical bills. And he found out when he left the hospital that his employer also didn't carry workers' compensation coverage because Texas is only one of 2 states, Oklahoma joined us the last legislative session, one of only 2 states that don't require employers to even carry workers' compensation coverage. So Santiago sued his employer, got close to $100,000, but that went straight to his medical care costs. His wife is now his full-time caretaker, so she feeds him and bathes him. And what you have to understand is that Santiago is one of the lucky ones, actually, because no place is more deadly to work in the country than Texas for construction workers. And whatever you may hear from our former governor, Rick Perry, that things are just worse in Texas just because it's bigger, the reality is that California has twice the size of the workforce that we do and 1/3 of the number of deaths. So I lay out this story so you can understand the context that we organize in Texas, and the fact that also in our industry, 41% of workers are misclassified, 41%. So we're up against a lot, which has forced us to be creative, has forced us to think about organizing in a new way, which I actually think is a good thing, and we try and learn from the labor movement in other parts of the country, but hopefully we can offer some lessons learned as well for you all. So even in the face of those kinds of conditions is why we think about our story as really a modern day story of David and Goliath. So our members that have the deck stacked completely against them, they don't vote because most of them are undocumented. They don't speak English. They're not even classified correctly as employees. And they are standing up to this giant industry. And they've been able to pass 2 statewide laws and a supermajority Republican legislature that are better protecting the rights of thousands of workers in the state. And we've taken on some of the largest corporations in the world. I wonder how many people have heard of a small company called Apple, right? So in Texas, the way we do business is we give millions of dollars away to corporations. Well, Apple, couple of years ago, got close to $30 million in tax breaks from our local state and county government to come build one of their largest facilities in our backyard. And everyone in city government was talking about how great this was going to be to bring all these high-tech, high-paying jobs to our city. But no one was talking about the janitorial workers, the construction workers, what kind of wages and conditions they would have. In fact, the city openly admitted they had never even thought of asking that. And so we were able to get Apple to sit down and negotiate with us, higher wages for construction workers, higher safety standards, but most importantly, that we would get to be on the project from start to finish to talk to all construction workers, union and non-union, to make sure that they were receiving the conditions that the standards had set out in the agreement that we were able to get with Apple. And now we have similar standards on over $500 million worth of construction projects in Austin, and have access to those work sites, again, from start to finish of the project, access to contractors and access to workers to make sure that our conditions are met. And because the city of Austin got incredibly tired of us flooding city council chambers every time with union and non-union workers, hundreds of workers, every time one of these agreements was up, they passed one of the most progressive economic development policies in the country for construction workers. So if you're going to get any tax dollars like these in the future for the city of Austin, you have to pay construction workers a living wage or prevailing wage, whichever is higher, because for some of our trades, prevailing wage is actually close to minimum wage in Texas. You have to have higher safety standards, workers' compensation, and there are incentives for hiring disadvantaged workers from training schools, Reed Union schools in Austin. So we're very, thank you. It's very hard to win. And now being in a place like Texas has forced us to be creative. And we try to think through how do we develop smart, sound strategy that is accompanied with smart workplace organizing campaigns that protects the good union jobs in the industry while also bringing up the floor for non-unionized workers. And that was not an easy sell for our union brothers and sisters about why they should work with us in the building trades. In fact, it was a rocky road to get them to be willing to work with us and see that it was really about leveling the playing field for all workers. So we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And one of the challenges is bringing up revenue. So when we won these campaigns against developers and they've signed an agreement, in the past we have gotten foundation money to allow us to monitor those projects. That is not a scalable model. You just create more work for yourself when you win a campaign, and then you have to pay for the burden of monitoring those projects. So now we've started to talk to developers about paying for the monitoring, that it is a service that should be paid for, and an investment into their projects, and an investment into our local communities. So we have some developers that have agreed to start paying for this, and just learned, if I'm allowed to announce. No. Something else? Okay. Got an eye from some. So the three big questions that we're really trying to answer when we do our work is, one, how do we actually improve working conditions for thousands of workers by making sure that we're negotiating with the real power broker in our industry? In construction, where 41% of workers are misclassified, that is not individual employers. It is developers and investors. And so we need to make sure we're actually negotiating with them. And that's a big challenge, I think, for the labor movement is we can no longer just negotiate with individual employers. It is not the road to power for workers. The second one is that how do we develop strategies that create a revenue stream when we win a campaign? And that's the big question we have to answer. I know that there's been lots of pieces written, even by people in this room. Are worker centers the future of the labor movement? And I will be the first worker center to argue they are not until they figure out a revenue stream. That no worker center at this point, there are some good creative ideas, but they are not scalable, and thus they cannot take on the industries and the economic power players in our country if they don't figure that out. And then lastly, I would say that how do we craft a message and a strategy that really makes sense for the South and resonates with our political climate and resonates with workers where we are. So oftentimes when unions come to Texas, you can go out and survey how many people actually even know when you say collective bargaining, what the hell you're talking about. They don't even know what you're talking about. Most of them don't really have any familiarity with a union. And while there have been tremendous gains on raising the minimum wage or winning paid sick days in other parts of the country, many of those propositions are illegal in many parts of the South. So we have to develop strategies that make sense for the South and not just expect that the South working conditions for workers are going to rise because we have really progressive strategies in the East and West Coast. And so that are those the big three questions that we ask ourselves is about revenue, making sure that we're negotiating with the right people, the right power players, and lastly, that we have a strategy that makes sense for our current political climate.
Great, thank you. Okay, Paul.
Hi, my name is Paul Booth. Okay, the union movement is 3.5 million members smaller than it was 40 years ago, and the forces that brought that about are energetically engaged just as they have been and as powerful as they have ever been. There are three big conclusions that have been drawn from that I want to attack, I want to challenge, and I want to rebut. Number one, that union organizing is impossible, futile, or a thing of the past. Number two, that the labor movement is dead or dying. And number three, that the best hope for workers is through something different from trade unions and collective bargaining. These are very disconcerting to me, these conclusions that have been jumped to. because they devalue the millions of workers who have risked much to try to unionize, and the thousands who are doing it today as we speak, and give no notice or so little notice to those who have done it and been successful. 1.5 million workers. How do I know that it's 1.5 million workers? Arithmetic. The 3.5 million number is a net number. So I simply added up the net shrinkage of union members by industry from the BLS annual survey. That's flawed. It's not a great database, but it's there. It's the best we have. And that's 5 million. 5 million from each of the industries out of which unions were driven. So 5 minus 3.5 is 1.5 million. So the labor movement has actually been growing while it's been shrinking. And those 5 million were driven out of our movement. This was not a matter of choice. This was forced. Ways that you all know, offshoring of what were union jobs, deunionization of major industries, the rise of relentlessly anti-union companies to dominance in industries, thwarting the promise of the labor law by the union busting being generally adopted by the playbook by employers, and casualization, et cetera. Okay. So, but in the face of all that, workers continue to organize and unions continue to support them. So I'm going to skip through all of the history and just jump to my conclusions, which are that this happened, there were two ingredients, basically just two. Workers willing to take risks, all of those involve workers taking risks, and unions taking risks too. And so if we accept the dominant narrative, the futility narrative about organizing, it makes it so much harder for me and my colleagues who are making the argument to trade unions that it's worth making the huge shifts in resources and investment and priority that we want them to make. It's self-defeating. So all of the, Tafari mentioned the 19,000 workers at American Airlines. David, it was mentioned with respect to David, the organizing drive for the home care workers in California. These were decades-long undertakings that involved the consistent, or in some cases inconsistent, but the commitment of huge resources and prioritization by trade unions to the success of those undertakings. In the first 20 of the 40 years of the net shrinkage, public workers did most of the organizing. 20 states in 20 years established a legal framework for the rights of public workers. We know what's happening to that now. In 1973, 40 years ago, public sector union density was lower than private sector density, 23% versus 24.2%. Within 20 years, that had all shifted. Most of the change that we currently live with had already happened in those 20 years. 1993, public sector union density had gone up to 37.7%, private sector was down to 11. And so it was at that point that organizers in the AFL-CIO and the labor movement undertook the changes that led to all of the organizing that I've just referred to. They set up the Organizing Institute, trained a whole new generation of organizers to a different theory of how you do the work. Training was rigorous. The organizing model was established. It continues. The conflict between the ideas behind the organizing model and the servicing model continues to animate serious discussion inside the labor movement. The placing of political capital into the fight, the John Sweeney campaign for president of the AFL-CIO, all of this should not be forgotten history. And millions of workers who organized unions were home care workers and child care providers, nurses and emergency medical technicians, hotel workers, adjunct college teachers, transportation security officers, taxi drivers, wireless telecom workers, drugstore workers, truck drivers in ports, pickle harvesters, bakery workers, passenger service agents. This is all real stories of wins, victories, 1,000 of them, every one of them illustrating commitment by unions, risk-taking by workers, creative strategies. There's an awful lot of creativity that has gone on as a result of the commitments of trade unions, of existing unions. that have made those changes. So some fights are picked by others, and we have to respond to them. Some fights we pick ourselves. Fights like Wisconsin, right to work, fights where they try to bust a union via lockout, bankruptcy, legislation, other tactics to become union-free, we have to respond to those. But there are fights that we pick, campaigns where we go on offense, where we take risks in order to grow our power. And for all of these, we need organizations that will tap everyone, not just in our unions, but outside our unions, that are willing to take action to support workers, even workers who are very different from themselves. We need rapid response capacity. We need those who are disposed to take action. They must be organized to be ready. As we take action, we need to build learning systems so that we build commitment and that the next fights will be more powerful. Organizing the unorganized does that, does all of that. Organizing is hard. Employers make damn sure that. It requires taking those risks and committing resources. But we have to place a bet on the future. The trade union movement has to place a bet on the future, and it has to be a very large bet. And it has to be one that we're willing to reinforce over and over and over again. The case for organizing has to be sufficiently compelling to merit such a bet. Now, movements grow up, sometimes spontaneously, and the economy that we're enduring constantly gives rise to the grievances that lead people to want to take action. But what flares up can flame out, and we've seen some flame outs. Unless we are prepared, unless we have organizations that have the ability to recognize fights with mass appeal and the capacity to carry a fight as far as it takes us. So that requires us to be missionaries. We have to be missionaries for organizing and for solidarity and for growing our unions. It's not a new idea, but it is the right idea. Organizing the unorganized is the highest priority for labor. Whether we're at a new crossroads or an all crossroads, that is the lesson that we have to take from this. It is the highest priority, and it is the kernel of our hopes for change in this country. Thank you.
Okay, well, it is no surprise that there is a wealth of interest here and questions, and I'm trying to organize this. Let me try to do this. We have some specific, almost factual-oriented questions. I'm going to put a bunch of these on the table rather than go through them one by one. For Christina and Sarah, just a question on how your organizations are funded. Sarah, how does the Freelancers Union put pressure on employers to raise standards? Christina, not only talking about the Texas Workers Defense Group, but there are other worker center success stories, and many of them have a focus on the immigrant workforce, Latinos in particular. How can immigration reform advocacy be coupled with labor organizing to build strength? A reference to the late Al Shanker's leadership genius, where he combined hard tactics and militancy, political mobilization, together with what's referred here as soft power. I would characterize it a little bit differently, but having to do with the quality of the institutions in which our members work, the fact that our members, and not just our members, but in general, workers want to do a good job. They would like support in enhancing their own skills, in addition to the wages, hours, and working conditions. How can we develop this leadership capacity, capability across the various sectors of the labor movement? Jessica, beyond the building trades example, is there any kind of movement within the AFT for consideration of the application of those pension funds and the power that resides within them to other sectors? And a question also, going beyond simply building trades jobs that connect generally, is there anything in terms of an orientation, earmarking perhaps to creating jobs outside of the rebuilding infrastructure that the AFT is advancing? What is the potential for labor organizing in multi-employer collective bargaining and geographically based organizing as opposed to individual workplace organizing. Anyway, these are some things that have surfaced. Maybe there are a couple of, taking quickly the specific questions to Christina and Sarah about your own organizations, and then we can move to the more general that's been put on the table.
So I would say that the thing I love most about my job is spending time thinking through strategy, though I spend a good 50% of my time hustling and tap dancing for money. So most of our funding comes from foundations, and then some unions, a very small percentage, and then some private businesses, and then individual donors, but the large lion's share is going to be from foundations. To go to the question about worker centers and the immigrant workforce, clearly for us, immigration reform is so critical for Texas. 1 in 10 workers in our state are undocumented. Not in our industry, but just the entire state. I think there are many unions that are really seeing executive action as a real organizing opportunity. Our organization has been thinking about it for several years and are thinking through it with our labor partners in the state and community partners to not just enroll people, but use it as a membership-based building opportunity. We hope to expand our membership base probably by like 7 times the size because of immigration reform or executive action in Texas, in our core cities. And in addition, bring in substantial revenue to the organization for charging for a service to help people enroll versus giving away the service and not being able to service many people. But then also being able to screen workers for what kind of training they have, who's their employer, what industry do they work in, what are their wages, would they like to be part of a union, and would they mind if we pass off their information to the respective union that makes sense given the industry that they work in. And also, clearly in the building trades, a major challenge in our state and in other places is the fact that many training programs, one, aren't available in Spanish, which the majority of the workforce are monolingual Spanish speakers. So that's a challenge that the building trades needs to address if they're actually going to be able to organize this workforce. And secondarily is the fact that now thousands of workers will have the opportunity to work for union contractors that have used E-Verify for the last several years and just hold on to the last several good jobs that exist currently in the Texas construction industry. So there will be lots of opportunities to organize, but again, this is just a sector of the workforce, so it's a good opportunity to prepare for one day if we have a Congress that decides to actually take action on immigration reform, when we'll actually be able to enroll millions versus thousands. So.
I just wanted to take this opportunity to just say one thing and then get to the question. I think that really, I hope for today is that we come to this in this spirit of really using any tool available. I can't imagine that anybody feels nothing but gratitude for the brothers and sisters who fought and built institutions, our grandparents and great-grandparents that, built something that let us come here today to have this conversation. And I think we're all here trying to think about, what will that be for our grandchildren and their children. And so I think it's in that spirit that I hope we hold that dear. So if you think about freelancer, people who work gig by gig and project to project will often have 6 employers, 8 employers. They'll have one employer for 1 month, and so you can't just engage in a strategy with one employer. There are different unions like the National Writers Union that I think have done that when they're focusing on, let's say, one employer that has a lot of freelancers. And so for us, instead, it's really been thinking about strategies. Our members came together and they literally built something called Contract Creator to build contracts to protect themselves. Another thing that that our members created was a client scorecard, so that it's really pretty interesting. They put about an employer that didn't pay them or did something not great, and we get regular emails and contact from employers and their lawyers telling us to pull it down. So we know that there's something in that, and I would say for us, strategically, the number one issue for our members has and still continues to be in many ways healthcare. So that a lot of them are above the subsidy level, just above, so they're still having difficulty getting healthcare. But I would say what we're now really seeing more than anything is unpaid wages. And so that one is going to become the next issue, where it's really trying to get a kind of crowdsourced orientation around what happens when one particular employer isn't paying people, and to start to really take a page from a lot of great organizing that's been done throughout the country in terms of an employer's brand is their bread and butter. And so really starting to think more broadly that way.
Any other questions that I had asked? Go ahead, Jess.
So in terms of the use of, or the application of pension funds, which represent an enormous opportunity, but also a responsibility. So the investment in infrastructure, long-term growth, meets our fiduciary responsibilities. Patient capital ensures that our those who participate in those plans will have a pension when it comes time, and will continue to get one if they're receiving it now. And from that lens, there are many other opportunities. I'll just give one example that also goes beyond just infrastructure jobs. The working with TIA-CREF, which many of you recognize, but in the higher ed world is usually the pension product of choice of faculty and others who work in higher education systems. And we've spent the last several years, because we have so many members who participate in the TIA-CREF plans, working directly with TIA-CREF on sort of responsible policies for their real estate investments. And the responsible policies are twofold. One is in the actual construction, but the second is in the building service and maintenance work that follows. And so through that relationship with TIA-CREF and working with our partners in unions representing those workers in either building service or in construction, we've been able to ensure that when TIA-CREF invests responsibly in real estate deals, that the jobs that are produced get, the workers have an opportunity to belong to a union, have union representation, and that they can bargain collectively with their employers. I would say also that we are, the frontiers of this work are yet to be discovered. That we are also, the pension, we have this situation many of you know with hedge fund managers who seek to manage our pension funds by day, that 1 to 2% of 300 billion earns them a lot of money. And yet by night, in their capacity as members of foundations or going to events where theoretically they're, you know, in their interests of vanity, are contributing to supposedly do good causes, are actually contributing to forces that would destroy public education. So you have this irony. They earn money from our members' deferred wages, because what else is a pension plan, by day, and then by night they're contributing to, in our world of education, the Manhattan Institute, Students First, organizations that have actually gone on record saying that a pension is, a defined benefit pension is actually not a good thing, and that we should change to defined contributions for teachers so that actually we can have higher turnover, less experienced teachers. And so you have this situation where they're contributing to organizations that want to destroy defined benefit plans for teachers, and yet they're making money off of defined benefit plans for teachers. So we're doing something about that. We publish an asset manager report once a year, and I want to let you know that it's been actually very successful. We've worked with, there have been a number of hedge funds that have actually stopped contributing to organizations that are calling for an end of defined benefit plans. And we intend to continue that work and to spotlight that because the potential in our pension plans is enormous. We have to be very careful about this. I mean, all of us, I think, read way back when The North Will Rise Again by Randy Barber, and then a number of union pension plans went out and did things that got them in jail. I'm looking at my sister from the maritime industry in particular. But things have changed, and we have those tools available to us, and we're only at the beginning of thinking about how we use this power.
Okay. Go ahead, Paul.
I want to go back to this question of class consciousness that got raised this morning and that Sarah has now re-raised by her summary call for us to see that we are actually entirely, all of us, freelancers or standard employees, we are in it together, which I think it was what you meant. I believe that the formation of class consciousness, there's a lot of historians in the room that can tell us, how to read about that. But, so much of it is formed through, and people's inclination to take collective, to contemplate collective action is formed through learning by doing it, as opposed to reading about it or being preached to about it. For us, this comes very acutely in the that Randy referred to this morning, the lack of American general public support for the institutions that promote the common good, the public services and sectors and structures of our society, so that our struggle as public employee unionists is made acutely more difficult by that challenge. But when we look back to what happened in Chicago when the teachers struck and how incredibly different public opinion turned into being by the question of keeping public schools open and making them good places for kids to go to, was raised by the sharpness of that struggle. The lesson from that, to me, is that any way and in any opportunity that we can link up what you are doing with what I am doing and what I am doing with what you are doing, and you is defined in the most broad of terms, as Sarah tried to just define it, that's the building block for making breakthroughs in terms of class consciousness, and that has to be part of our agenda, no matter what we are doing in whatever sector for whatever group of workers. We always have to have the agenda item of how do we link it to what somebody else is doing somewhere else.
A good final comment. All right, we are out of time. Let's thank the panel for a great job. Okay. Leo?
So we have one final and important event before we let you loose on lunch. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this next session. He is widely known to all of you in this room because over the 31 years that Steve Greenhouse reported for the New York Times, I think all of us have grown to rely upon him for reporting not just the latest developments regarding the state of American labor, but also for casting a much-needed light on the abuses of American working people that have grown over the last 30 years as unions have been weakened. Steve, as you all know, retired from the New York Times just last month. Many of us look forward to the state of labor report in the New York Times with a little fear and trepidation now. But he is planning on writing another book, following up on the book that he wrote, which won a Sidney Hillman Prize in 2009, The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for American Workers. So Steve will be sharing with us his reflections on the current state of American labor.
Thank you very much. I know you've been sitting a long time, so I will try my darndest to keep you awake. First, I want to thank the Schenker Institute and the American Prospect and the Sidney Hillman Foundation and Leo in particular for arranging this impressive array of speakers on this very important topic. I reminded Leo that when I was at NYU Law School back in 1982, I organized a conference that was called The Labor Movement at the Crossroads. How does that saying go? History repeats itself. I was incredibly flattered by what Labor Secretary Perez said about me. And I just want to say there are other terrific labor reporters, some of them in this room, Harold Meyerson, David Moberg, Dave Jamieson, Lydia DePillis, Josh Idelson. You know, there's a very good sorority fraternity of labor reporters, and long may they thrive. And I hope there will soon be another one at the New York Times. I must confess, I felt very torn retiring from the New York Times. I loved my job, I loved my beat, but I'd been working my fanny off for 31 years, and I'm 63, and I said it was time. And I often told myself, my father, who was continued teaching community college as a low-paid adjunct, as an adjunct till the age of 82, would have said, Steve, you're just a kid. How could you leave the New York Times at the age of 63? And my mother would have said, Stephen, you're working too hard. You should retire. You're going to have a heart attack. So anyway, so I hope to continue writing about labor. I'm going to write another book. I just want to say something that some of you have already heard, that when my father left the Army in 1945, the first job he took was with Sidney Hillman at the AFL-CIO, when Hillman was heading the Committee on Political Education, basically the political action department of organized labor of the AFL-CIO. So now to my formal remarks. I just want to make clear, I'm not here as an advocate, I'm here as an observer discussing what I've seen in my years writing about labor. One observation, as many of you know, as I wrote about at length in my book, is that things are very broken for the American worker. You know, the rise of part-time labor, contingent labor, misclassification, wage theft. I could talk about that for 2 hours, but I think many of you understand all that. Another observation, the American political system and its campaign finance system are also fundamentally broken. And I believe that American workers will not get a fair deal so long as from the political system, as long as the campaign finance system allows virtually unlimited spending by the ultra-rich. In my view, workers will get a fair shake only when there is public financing of national and state campaigns. And I think this is an important thing for people who believe in fairness, for the labor movement to sincerely think about. I often imagine that if members of Congress had to rely on public financing rather than on tap dancing in front of for their wealthy donors, a higher minimum wage would have breezed through Congress long ago. And I realize it might take a constitutional amendment to bring about real public financing, and I also realize that there are forces in society that will fight very hard against that. I began covering labor in late 1995, just as John Sweeney was elected president of the AFL-CIO and someone named Richard Trumka was elected vice president. And the Sweeney-Trumka leadership did a lot of things that one would think needed to be done to reverse organized labor's decline. They did larger organizing campaigns, they built up training, they spent more money on organizing, they got young people much more involved in labor through Union Summer, they got clergy and academics involved. They made labor an ally rather than an enemy of immigrants. They used social media more effectively. They improved their website. But despite all these smart efforts, union density continued to sink. Yes, there were some big victories. 74,000 home care workers organized in LA in 1999. the many thousands of airline workers, tens of thousands who voted to unionize. The Teamsters have had great success, unheralded success in organizing more than 10,000 bus drivers with First Student, and the AFT organized 28,000 child care workers in New York. I mean, these are major, major successes. They took a lot of perspiration, inspiration, intelligence. But despite such victories, net, the union movement, the labor movement, has been shrinking. Many have dissected why this is happening. I agree that the foremost reason why labor is declining is that employer resistance has gotten so sophisticated and at times aggressive. Employers really know how to beat back unionization drives. But that's not the only reason. Some unions have largely given up on organizing. Some unions no longer have the expertise to mount a smart, large organizing drive even if they wanted to. With unions no longer in the news much, no longer at the center of things as they were back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, a lot of workers know precious little about unions, and some have bought into the notion, pushed by folks on the right, that unions are there just to take your dues and don't do much for you. It's also true that many workers who are unhappy with their wages and working conditions are too scared to stick their necks out to support a union. They worry they'll get fired or demoted. And in ways, the legal structure is tilted against unions and union organizing. For instance, employers have access to workers 24/7 for one-on-one meetings, to show videos, while union organizers are prohibited from setting foot on company property. That's a long list of reasons why labor organizers face such a problem, why unions are shrinking, and I don't think there are any easy answers to reverse any of these factors contributing to organized labor's decline, and any easy answer to reversing the overall problem. In my book, The Big Squeeze, I wrote about the SEIU's victory in organizing 5,200 janitors in Houston. I wrote about that because it was such a signal success in unionizing an unlikely group. The janitors all work for some subcontractors. They all work part-time. Almost all of them were undocumented. Very few of them spoke English. But as a result of this organizing victory and the subsequent contract, these janitors' work weeks went from 20 hours a week to 30 hours a week. Their hourly pay rose 60%, and that meant that their wages doubled within 3 years, plus they got health coverage for the first time. And I wrote about that example because it shows how a successful unionization drive can lift the lives of thousands of families. In recent weeks, I've been asking some friends, for other examples of recent unionization campaigns that have translated into similar significant improvements in wages and benefits. And I really haven't heard of any such examples. But, my ears are open for other examples. I realize in the recent contract won by service workers at the Los Angeles School District, 20,000 custodians, special ed assistants, and safety monitors, cafeteria workers are seeing their wages go from $8, $9, $10 an hour to $15 an hour by 2016. That's a significant victory. I think that stems in part from the election of a pro-labor mayor in Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, that mayor who was opposed by organized labor in the primaries. 2 years ago in January, the BLS reported that union density had dropped to 11.3% from 11.8%. That's a very major drop in 1 year. And that overall union membership had fallen by 400,000, even though the overall workforce had grown by 2.5 million in the preceding year. The next day, my editor, the business editor of the New York Times, called me in for a meeting and said, "Steve, I think it would be smart to do a series of articles about what's going to happen to workers' voice. Who's going to speak up for workers when traditional unions are declining? Some would say even shriveling." So out of that request, I profiled some organizations whose leaders just spoke, the Freelancers Union, the Workers' Defense Project, and I also wrote about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. I wrote about the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy. I've written about many other worker centers, Make the Road, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, the Retail Action Project, Domestic Workers United. I've written about Rich Trumka and how organized labor is allying itself more than ever with worker centers and immigrant groups, African American groups, environmental groups to push forward with a progressive agenda, partly because labor has recognized that it is no longer as strong as it once was and can't achieve things by itself the way it used to. Sarah Horowitz and Christina Chinchun, just talked a few minutes ago about their organization successes, and I was always impressed that Itsy Bitsy Workers' Defense Project was able to win such an impressive victory against Apple. I'm not going to call Apple a Goliath. It's too smart to be considered a Goliath, but hats off on that victory. One of the great stories about the Workers' Defense Project is, when they were a small group with like 5, 6 staff members, they were alarmed about the number of construction worker deaths in Texas in one year. It's about 130. So they built, black wooden coffins for like 130 workers, and then this little group got hundreds of, construction workers involved in building these coffins, and they marched through the streets of Austin carrying these 130 or so coffins. And and that was just brilliant. I'll use the word marketing or strategizing, that this little group with a small budget used its brains and creativity to get humongous amounts of attention to this cause of worker deaths. It was on TVs, it was on front pages, and I think that's a good example of showing how smart, creative organizers could really do a lot, even when they don't have much money. So of the many non-union worker advocacy groups I've looked at, 2, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and LANE, the Los Angeles Alliance of a New Economy, have, as far as I can tell, achieved the most in terms of numbers of workers helped. And I'll be the first to say that these worker centers, these alt-labor groups, a phrase Josh Idelson developed, will probably never achieve as much as labor unions will in their prime. But at a time when unions are in decline and unions are having such a hard time organizing, and many workers are desperate for some voice and some way to improve their methods, their wages and working conditions, they're turning increasingly to worker centers, and the labor movement is very smartly helping underwrite many worker centers. So the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has lifted 30,000 tomato workers in Florida, again, many of them undocumented, and it's increased their wages by about 30%, and it has introduced a system that has gone far to curb sexual harassment and ensure rest breaks and working in the 95-degree heat in the tomato fields of Florida. And so how did this group, again, a small group, Greg Asbed, Laura Germino went down there in the 1990s. They founded this group. They work with Haitian immigrants, Hispanic immigrants, and they've built this into this real powerhouse in Florida. And so how did they achieve this? They took on Yum Brands, Taco Bell, and they did protest marches, they did hunger strikes, they did sit-ins, they got arrested, they did about 200-mile marches, they got, of all the worker centers in the country, they're the ones that have really lined up student groups around the country backing them. And then when they have a protest against Taco Bell's or McDonald's, student groups around the country are rallying behind them and joining their boycotts. So again, I use this as an example of how very smart, very creative, very determined worker center, working closely with the community, can really do a tremendous amount to lift workers. And the Coalition of Immokalee Workers really said, instead of focusing on the growers who only have a limited amount of money, they're paid a certain amount, they said, hey, we have to focus on the folks with the deep pockets, the Taco Bells, the McDonald's, and they've done very successful pressure campaigns, and they've gotten a lot of these groups to say uncle, cry uncle. Is it sexist to say cry uncle? Cry auntie, okay. The second group is the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, and we heard Elizabeth Bunn and others mention some of their success with the Jobs to Move America campaign, but I would suggest that that's the least of their successes. I mean, this group was founded 20 years ago, and working closely with Unite Here and the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, and Harold Meyerson has written wonderful stuff about them. LANE got the City Council of Los Angeles to approve a $15.37 base wage for thousands of hotel workers in Los Angeles. And thanks in part to LANE strategizing, LA seems well on its way to enacting a $13 citywide minimum wage. And remember, LA isn't as liberal as Seattle or as San Francisco, and the cost of living in LA isn't nearly as high as San Francisco or Seattle, so $13 ain't bad. Lane has accomplished much else. It pushed through one of the nation's first living wages, and that was, Baltimore's first, Los Angeles was second, and it's the Los Angeles one that really got the living wage movement rolling around the nation. Lane has assured far more minority hiring in city agencies and in city-backed construction projects. It has spearheaded a very impressive overhaul of the city's waste hauling industry that's going to greatly reduce pollution and improve conditions for some of the recycling workers that the ferry was talking about earlier. Lane owes its success most of all to the vision and creativity of three people, Maria Elena Durazo, Miguel Contreras, and Madeline Janis. They saw that labor had to build community alliances to succeed and had to help elect worker-friendly politicians. Lane's successes were, of course, helped by the fact that hundreds of thousands of Latino immigrants moved to LA, helping increase labor's power. In my view, one of the key tests for worker advocates today is whether they can build on what Lane has done and achieve similar successes in other cities. When David Rolfe gave his terrific talk earlier, I think David was in ways too modest. Because in Seattle, it wasn't just the Fight for 15 fast food workers that got the city of Los Angeles and got the mayor to back $15 minimum wage in the city. It was that Seattle has a real kick-ass progressive community. It's David's home care workers local, the UFCW local in Seattle is has its act together, is very aggressive. The Teamsters in Seattle are unusual for Teamster locals. Then they work with clergy is very powerful. Immigrant groups, and they work very closely with gay groups. Have been very, very, very important in backing some of their efforts. So it's that soil, that fertile soil, that when the Fight for 15 really kicked in Seattle, that got the city council, that got the mayoral candidates saying, $15 is a good idea, and they were the first big city in the country to enact that. So lastly, in many ways, the most promising thing going on right now in organized labor is the Fight for 15 movement. And when I first wrote about it 2 years ago, and there were strikes at like 20, 30 restaurants in New York City involving 200 workers, I thought, that's an interesting little phenomenon, and I thought it would, go away. And now we've seen it in 150 cities, tens of thousands of workers, and I remember what Karen Nussbaum said to me in an interview about a year ago. Karen said, you can't solve the problems of the labor movement or the progressive movement until you restore the belief in collective power. And I think what we're seeing with the Fight for 15 movement, with the Our Walmart protests on Black Friday, with the Ferguson protests, with the Eric Garner protests, is there's some incipience even to, there's some, people are so upset and so angry that they're acting collectively. I'm not saying this is collectivism. I'm not going there. But the question is, as some people said, is, these are important steps if labor is going to rise again, if labor is going to help workers again, but can these really be translated into movements? And the SEIU has put a lot of money and a lot of organizers behind the Fight for 15 movement, but now a big question is, can they deliver on getting $15 for the workers? And if they can, that's a humongous success. If they can't, we're going to have to figure out, labor's going to have to figure out what all that means. I just want to end with, I was having a drink last night with some labor leader who said, we're at a moment in American history where the labor movement is weaker than ever before, certainly the weakest it's been since the Great Depression, but never before has, considering the condition of American workers right now and wage stagnation, there's never been a time when we need the labor movement more. So I think, there are a lot of questions facing traditional organized labor, facing worker centers, because when you look at the results of the elections last November, you look at what's happening with wages, you look at increased inequality, there's a lot of frustration out there among workers. And I don't think we need to use terms like class. There's just a lot of anger and alienation and upset, and people want a fairer deal. I think Mr. Truman, used to use a good phrase once upon a time. People think things are unfair, and the question is, how can that anger, upset, dismay be converted into an effort to create a fairer America with less inequality? So I will stop there. Okay.
So I don't think anybody's written any questions on cards. Let me do this. We have bag lunches for you out there. The object is you can just pick them up. You can come in here. You can sit down. We're going to give you half an hour both to eat and to chat with people you want to chat with. But in my capacity as presiding union thug, we will reconvene exactly in 30 minutes and restart with the rest of the program.